At 78 years old, Helen sat on the edge of a sagging motel bed and counted the money in her purse. $9. For singles, for quarters, and a collection of dimes and nickels that felt impossibly heavy. Beside her, her husband Frank stared at the television, but his eyes were not seeing the flickering game show. His hands, once so sure and capable, rested on his knees, looking lost without the familiar weight of a tool or the grain of a piece of wood. Their son, Mark, had left them there 3 days ago. He had taken their home, a house Frank built with his own 2 hands. He had taken their savings, a lifetime of careful planning Helen had managed down to the penny. He had taken their future and replaced it with a room that smelled of stale cigarettes and quiet desperation. They were supposed to fade away. They were supposed to be a problem solved. But they didn't. Instead, with a resolve she didn't know she still possessed, Helen took Frank to an estate sale. There, surrounded by the ghosts of another person's life, she bought a forgotten piano. And wedged deep inside its wooden heart, they found a lifeline they never could have imagined, a brittle, yellow deed to a place that no longer existed on any modern map. They took that deed to a derelict shell of a building in a town the world had forgotten, and with their bare hands and the ghosts of their former skills, they started to build again. They did not build a fortress for revenge. They built a home. They built a sanctuary. They built a thriving community from the discarded pieces of other people's lives, and in doing so, they found a quiet, unshakable justice their own son never believed they were capable of. But to understand how they turned absolute ruin into a kingdom of the unwanted, I need to take you back to the very beginning. The house had been their universe. It stood on a 2-acre plot of land carved from an old farm, framed by oak trees Frank had refused to cut down. He had drawn the plans himself on their small kitchen table in the apartment they rented for the first 5 years of their marriage. Helen had watched him, his pencil moving with a certainty that she found grounding. He wasn't an architect, he was a cabinet maker, but he understood how things fit together. He understood foundations. A house has to breathe, Helen, he would say, sketching out windows. It needs to take in the morning sun and let out the heat of the day. He built it over 2 years of weekends and evenings, after long days at the workshop. Helen would bring him sandwiches and iced tea, her belly swelling first with Mark, then with Lisa. She learned the names of the tools, the difference between a joist and a beam. She saw the structure rise from the dirt, a skeleton of pine and fir that slowly grew a skin of cedar siding. Every nail was a promise. Every window was a view into their future. Inside, Frank's true artistry emerged. The kitchen cabinets were seamless, the grain of the maple flowing from one door to the next. The bookshelves in the living room were built into the walls, sturdy enough to hold the weight of all the stories Helen would bring home from the school library where she worked. He built a window seat in the bay window, and it was there Helen sat and read to her children, the afternoon light pooling around them. They had lived within those walls for 51 years. It was the only home Mark and Lisa had ever known. It held the memory of scraped knees and birthday parties, of arguments and reconciliations. It was where Frank taught Mark how to use a hammer and where Helen taught Lisa how to balance a checkbook. The house was not just a possession, it was a living record of their family, of their work, of their love. When Frank retired, his hands, stiff with arthritis, could no longer manage the fine detail of cabinetry. He turned his attention to the garden. He built raised beds and a small greenhouse, his movements slower but just as deliberate. Helen retired 2 years later, and their days fell into a comfortable rhythm. Coffee on the porch, Frank in his garden, Helen with her books and the town's charitable accounts she volunteered to manage. Their life was not grand, but it was secure. It was theirs. The first crack in that security came quietly. It came in the form of their son, Mark. He was a financial advisor in the city, with a sharp suit and an even sharper smile. He spoke of portfolios and leveraging assets, a language that felt foreign to Helen, who had always believed in the simple math of earning more than you spend. He visited one Sunday, bringing a store-bought apple pie that sat untouched on the counter. He spread a sheaf of papers across the polished surface of the dining table Frank had built. "We need to talk about estate planning," Mark said, his tone one of practiced patience. "The house. It's your biggest asset, but it's also your biggest liability. Frank looked at him, confused. It's paid for, son. Has been for 30 years. That's not what I mean, Dad, Mark said, tapping a pen on a document. I'm talking about long-term care. If one of you gets sick, really sick, and needs to go into a home, the government will make you liquidate everything to pay for it. They'll take the house. All your work, gone. Helen felt a chill. She had read about this. It was a fear that lurked in the quiet corners of old age. So what are you suggesting? She asked, her voice steady. I've had a lawyer draw this up, Mark said, pushing a paper toward them. A quitclaim deed. You sign the house over to me. Legally, it becomes my property. It's protected from Medicaid, from creditors, from everything. You two continue to live here, of course. Nothing changes. This is your home. Always. This just protects it. It protects you. It sounded so sensible. So caring. Mark was using his expertise to look after them, just as they had always looked after him. Frank, who trusted his son implicitly, was ready to sign. But Helen, the observer, hesitated. For 50 years, she had been the keeper of their security. Every decision, from the brand of coffee they bought to the insurance policies they held, had passed through her careful consideration. Let me read it over, she said. Mark's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course. But the lawyer said we should file it before the end of the quarter. For tax reasons. Helen read every word. The legal language was dense, but the core of it was clear. It was a transfer of ownership. Complete and total. There was no clause that guaranteed them lifetime residency. There was no mention of their right to stay. When she pointed this out, Mark waved it away. That's just boilerplate, Mom. It's standard. Do you really think I'd ever ask you to leave your own home? I'm your son. The words hung in the air. I'm your son. It was an appeal to love, to history, to a bond that was supposed to be unbreakable. To doubt him felt like a betrayal. She looked at Frank, who nodded, his expression clear. He trusted Mark. How could she not? She called their daughter, Lisa, that evening. Lisa was a kindergarten teacher in another state, a gentle soul who had always been more heart than head. Helen explained the situation. Oh, I don't know, Mom, Lisa said, her voice uncertain. Mark is so smart about all that money stuff. If he says it's the best way to protect the house, he probably knows best. It sounds like he's just trying to help. Her validation, however hesitant, was the final push. It was 2 against 1. Her caution against their trust. Helen gave in. They met Mark at a notary's office the following week. Frank's signature was firm. Helen's wavered slightly as she signed away the deed to the only home she had ever known. As she lifted the pen, she felt a profound and inexplicable sense of loss, as if she had just closed a door she would never be able to open again. For 6 months, nothing changed. Life continued its placid rhythm. Frank tended his tomatoes. Helen read on the window seat. Mark called every Sunday. The fear that had bloomed in Helen's chest slowly receded. She had been foolish to doubt him. He was their son. Then, a for sale sign appeared in their front yard. Frank saw it first. He was coming in from the garden, his hands covered in dirt. He stopped at the end of the driveway and just stared at it. A handsome sign with a smiling realtor's face next to Mark's phone number. Helen ran out when he didn't come inside. She saw the sign, then looked at her husband's face. The color had drained from it. He looked like a man who had been struck from behind. It must be a mistake, she whispered, but she knew it wasn't. She called Mark immediately. He didn't answer. She called again. And again. Finally, a text message appeared on her phone. Can't talk now. We'll explain later. Don't worry. Worry. It was a tidal wave. It swamped her, stole her breath. The next day, the realtor, a woman with a brittle smile, came to the door. She wanted to schedule an open house. There's been a misunderstanding, Helen said, her voice trembling. This is our home. We're not selling. The realtor looked at her with a kind of professional pity. The property is listed by the legal owner, Mark Peterson. I have the paperwork right here. The truth was a physical blow. Helen had to grip the doorframe to stay upright. Frank stood behind her, silent, his face a mask of disbelief. Mark finally showed up 2 weeks later. The open house had been a success. The market was hot. He had an offer, well over asking price. He walked into the living room, the room his father had built, and avoided their eyes. I got an incredible offer, Mom. You wouldn't believe it. This is going to set you both up for life. What are you talking about? Frank's voice was a low growl, a sound Helen hadn't heard in decades. This is our house. It's my house, Dad. Legally, Mark said, his voice taking on a defensive edge. And this is the best decision for everyone. The upkeep is getting to be too much for you. The property taxes are insane. This way, you're free. I'm investing the proceeds for you. You'll have a nice, steady income. I found a wonderful senior community for you. It's got a golf course, a pool. We don't want a golf course, Helen said, her voice cold as ice. We want our home. You don't understand finances, Mom, he snapped, his composure finally breaking. This house is a lazy asset. It's just sitting here. I'm making it work for you. Why can't you just trust me? Trust you? Frank stepped forward. I trusted you when I signed that paper. Was this your plan all along? Mark flinched. He looked away, at the bookshelves his father had built, at the scuff marks on the floor where he and his sister had played as children. For a moment, Helen saw a flicker of the boy he had been. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the hard glaze of a man justifying the unjustifiable. It makes the most sense, he mumbled. It's for your own good. The sale closed in 30 days. They had no legal standing to stop it. They were tenants in a house they no longer owned. The new owners, a young couple with 2 small children, wanted to move in immediately. Helen and Frank packed 51 years of life into cardboard boxes. Every object held a memory, a story. The chipped mug Frank always used. The Afghan Helen's mother had knitted. The children's books with torn pages and crayon marks. They sold the furniture that wouldn't fit into whatever came next. They gave things away to neighbors who looked at them with a mixture of pity and confusion. On the final day, Mark arrived. He didn't help with the last few boxes. He stood in the driveway, his car idling. The new family was waiting down the street in a moving van. All right, let's go, he said, his voice strained. I'll take you to the motel. You can stay there for a bit while I sort out the paperwork for the new place. The wonderful senior community had a 6-month waiting list and a buy-in they couldn't afford, a fact he had conveniently omitted. The motel was the solution. Frank took one last look at the house. He reached out and touched the cedar siding, his fingers tracing a line he had cut half a century ago. He didn't say a word. They got into Mark's pristine luxury car. It smelled of leather and air freshener. As they pulled away, Helen looked back. The young mother was walking toward the front door, holding her child's hand. She was pointing at the window seat. Their window seat. The motel was on a busy highway, nestled between a pawn shop and a 24-hour diner. The sign had 2 burnt-out letters. Mark checked them in, paying for a week in cash. He walked them to their room. The air inside was thick and damp. He put the key on the dresser. He still wouldn't meet their eyes. I'll transfer some money to your account, he said. And I'll call you in a few days. Once I get the funds from the sale organized. He turned to leave. Mark, Helen said, her voice flat. He stopped at the door. How much? She asked. How much did you sell our home for? He hesitated. $750,000. The number was staggering. A lifetime of equity. And the money you're transferring, she pressed. 5,000, he said, his voice low. To get you started. He opened the door and was gone before they could say another word. They heard his car speed away. They stood in the silence of the grim little room. $750,000. And he had left them with 5,000. And a week in a motel. Frank slowly sat down on the bed. He looked at his hands. He sold our house, he said, not as a question, but as a statement of impossible fact. Helen went to the bank the next day. The $5,000 was there. So was the rest of their savings account, $2,312. Everything else, their investments, their retirement funds, had been consolidated years ago by Mark into an account that now, she discovered, bore only his name. She tried to report the theft of the house to the police. The officer was polite but dismissive. You said you signed the deed over to him, correct? A quitclaim deed. Yes, but he lied to us. He said it was to protect us. The officer sighed. I understand, but you signed the document. It was a legal transfer of property. If there was fraud involved, that's a civil matter. You'll need to hire a lawyer. A lawyer. With what money? They were bleeding funds just to exist. The motel was $60 a day. Food was another $30. The $5,000 Mark had given them was a pittance, designed to keep them quiet for a month or two before it ran out. The week Mark had paid for came and went. He didn't call. Helen paid for another week. He never called. The money dwindled. The calls to Mark's phone went straight to voicemail. His mailbox was full. He had vanished. Lisa called, crying. She had tried to reach him too. He wasn't answering her calls either. She didn't have any money to send them, she had 2 kids and a mortgage and a teacher's salary. Despair was a physical presence in the room. It was in the threadbare carpet and the water-stained ceiling. Frank barely spoke. He sat and watched television, his face slack. The light in his eyes, the spark of ingenuity and pride that had defined him, was gone. He was disappearing before her eyes. One afternoon, Helen watched him try to fix a wobbly leg on the small table in their room. He fumbled with the screwdriver, his arthritic hands unable to get a proper grip. He gave up, slumping back onto the bed in frustration. Seeing his hands, those hands that had built a house, fail at such a simple task broke something in her. She knew in that moment that if they stayed there, they would die. Not from poverty, but from hopelessness. The motel room would be their tomb. That evening, she sat on the bed and counted their remaining cash. After paying for another week at the motel, they had $900 left in the bank, and the $9 in cash in her purse. $909 to their name. She looked at Frank, who was asleep, his face troubled even in dreams. The observer in her, the librarian who managed accounts and saw patterns, took over. She could not let their story end here. It was an unacceptable conclusion. They were not disposable people. She needed a plan. But plans required resources, and they had none. They were at the bottom of a deep, dark well, with no ladder and no light. The next morning, she woke Frank up early. "Get dressed," she said, her voice firmer than it had been in weeks. "We're getting out of this room." "Where are we going?" he asked, his voice dull. "I don't know yet," she said. "But we're not staying here." She saw a notice in the lobby for an estate sale at a house a few miles away. It was an echo of their own fate, another life packed into boxes. She didn't know why, but she felt a pull. It was something to do. It was movement. It was not sitting in that room waiting for the end. She drove their old, rattling sedan to a quiet, tree-lined street. The house was a modest brick colonial, well-kept. A lifetime of possessions were laid out on the lawn and inside, tagged with prices. People, strangers, picked through the remnants of a family. Frank wandered aimlessly, touching nothing. He looked lost. Helen walked through the rooms, a strange sense of detachment washing over her. She saw a set of dishes just like the ones she'd had. A rocking chair. It was like walking through a museum of her own lost life. Then she saw it. Tucked away in a corner of the formal living room, covered by a dusty sheet, was a piano. It was an old upright, its mahogany wood dark and rich, but faded and scratched in places. A sign on it read, $100, as is. Must move yourself. It was an absurd price. And an even more absurd purchase for two people living in a motel room. They had nowhere to put it. They could barely afford to move it. It was illogical. It was foolish. But Helen was drawn to it. She lifted the sheet. The manufacturer's name, Winter & Company, was inlaid in elegant brass letters above the keys. She touched one. It made no sound. She tried another. Silence. The keys were yellowed and chipped, like old teeth. A few were missing entirely. The piano was broken, forgotten. A beautiful, useless thing. Just like them. She felt a sudden, fierce wave of protectiveness for it. She couldn't explain it. It was a feeling that came from a place deeper than logic. Frank came up behind her. "What are you looking at, Helen?" "This piano," she said. He looked at it, then at the price tag. He shook his head. $100? For junk? We need that money. "I know," she said. "But look at it, Frank. The woodwork. It's beautiful." She ran her hand along the side. The wood was solid. The joints were tight. It was well made. It had good bones. "It's still standing," she said softly, more to herself than to him. The woman running the sale, the daughter of the deceased, was eager to get rid of it. $100 and it's yours," she said. "Frankly, I'd pay someone to take it away." "I'll give you 75, Helen said, the old habit of careful negotiation returning to her. "Sold," the woman said without a second's hesitation. Frank stared at her as if she had lost her mind. $75? "Helen, where are we going to put a piano? In the motel room?" "No," she said, though she had no idea what the answer was. She just knew she had to have it. It was the first decision she had made in weeks that felt like her own. It was an act of defiance against their circumstances. A crazy, beautiful, $75 act of defiance. "Then what?" he pressed, his voice filled with the anxiety she had been carrying for both of them. She looked at him, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of a challenge for him, a problem to be solved. "You're the one who knows how to move heavy things, Frank. You'll figure it out." Hiring movers was out of the question. Frank, galvanized by the sheer insanity of the task, went to a tool rental shop. He rented 2 heavy-duty dollies and a set of furniture straps. The rental cost them another $40. Helen's heart ached at the expense, but she didn't waver. Getting the piano out of the house was a slow, grueling process. It was a monument of wood and iron. Frank's movements were careful, his old expertise returning in flashes. He analyzed the angles, the pivot points. He instructed Helen where to push, where to brace. His hands, though pained, were sure as they tightened the straps. It took them 2 hours to get it onto the small, rented utility trailer they hitched to their car. They drove back to the motel, a massive, broken piano trailing behind them like a coffin. The motel manager came out, his arms crossed. "You can't bring that here," he said flatly. "No storage. No large items." Of course. Helen hadn't even considered it. She had acted on pure, blind instinct. They were parked in the motel lot, with a piano they couldn't keep and $75 fewer in their account. Frank looked at her, his face a mixture of exasperation and a strange, grudging respect. "Well, planner," he said, the nickname a relic from a happier time. "What's the plan now?" Helen looked at the piano. It seemed to absorb the harsh afternoon sun, its faded wood glowing. She refused to let this be another failure. "We find a place to put it," she said. A storage unit. Just for a few days, until we figure things out. They found a place a few miles away that offered the first month for $1. The absurdity of their situation was almost comical. They were spending their last reserves to store a broken instrument. They maneuvered the piano into the cold, concrete box of a 10 by 10 unit. The metal door rolled down with a deafening clang, sealing it in darkness. The dollar felt like a fortune. That night, back in the motel room, the air felt different. The despair was still there, but it was joined by something else, exhaustion from physical labor, and the lingering ghost of purpose. We spent over $100 today on junk, Frank said, but there was no accusation in his voice. Only wonder. It's not junk, Helen said. It's just waiting. The next day, she insisted they go back to the storage unit. She brought a rag and a bottle of wood oil she'd bought at the dollar store. She needed to do something. She needed to care for something. She rolled up the metal door, letting the daylight flood in. The piano sat there, silent and massive. Frank, with nothing else to do, brought in a small folding chair from their car and sat, watching her. Helen started with the top. She wiped away years of dust, her rag coming away black. As the grime disappeared, the rich, red undertones of the mahogany began to show. The wood was thirsty, drinking in the oil she rubbed into it. She worked slowly, methodically, her mind blessedly empty of everything but the task at hand. She cleaned the keys, wiping away the yellow film. She discovered that they weren't silent because they were broken, but because the felt hammers inside had become disconnected from the action. A mechanical problem. A fixable problem. As she was cleaning the intricate fretwork of the music stand, she noticed something. A piece of paper, folded and yellowed with age, was wedged deep inside the piano soundboard, visible only through a small gap in the cast iron plate. It was almost impossible to see, tucked behind a thick copper-wound bass string. Her heart quickened. It was probably nothing. A child's drawing. A forgotten shopping list. "Frank," she said, her voice quiet. "Come look at this." He peered over her shoulder. "What is it?" "There's something stuck in there. I can't reach it." Frank's eyes narrowed. The problem solver in him awoke. He went back to the car and returned with a pair of needle-nose pliers from his old, neglected toolbox. He studied the angle for a long moment. "I have to be careful not to snap the string," he muttered, mostly to himself. His hand was surprisingly steady as he reached the pliers deep into the piano's guts. He gently gripped the edge of the paper. He pulled, slowly, carefully, wiggling it back and forth. The paper was brittle. It threatened to crumble. After a tense minute, it came free. He held it in his palm. It was a small bundle of papers, folded together and bound with a faded red ribbon. They were impossibly old. Helen took the bundle, her fingers trembling as she untied the ribbon. Inside were several letters, written in a looping, elegant script, and a single, heavier document. The document was a deed. She unfolded it carefully. The paper was like a dried leaf. The text, written in ornate calligraphy, was for a parcel of land and a building designated as a tinsmith's workshop and storefront. The property was located in a town called Oak Haven, a place she had never heard of. The deed was dated 1923. It was made out to a man named Alastair Finch. The letters, she realized, were from him, addressed to his sister. Helen read the first one aloud, her voice soft in the stillness of the storage unit. "Dearest Clara," it began. "The business has failed. The new mass-produced goods from the city have made my craft obsolete. The bank has taken our home. I have hidden the deed to the workshop inside your mother's piano. It is all I have left that is free and clear. The bank does not know of it. It is a worthless property now, on an unpaved road, but it is something. It is a foundation. Should you ever find yourself in dire straits, it is yours. A place to start again." Helen's breath caught in her throat. She looked at Frank. His eyes were wide. She read the other letters. They told a story of a family's financial ruin, of displacement, of feeling obsolete in a changing world. It was their story, written a century ago. The final letter was from Clara, dated 1945. She wrote that she never needed the workshop, that she had married well and moved away. She had kept the piano, and the secret deed, as a memory of her brother. The woman at the sale, Helen whispered. She must have been Clara's granddaughter. She never knew. They looked at the deed again. The address was for 14 Mill Street, Oakhaven. There was a plot number and a legal description. Oakhaven, Frank said, testing the word. I think I've heard of that. It's a little town out east. Past the old quarries. Mostly abandoned now. Mostly abandoned. A worthless property on an unpaved road. A place to start again. The words echoed in the concrete room. A spark of an idea, so wild and desperate it barely seemed possible, ignited in Helen's mind. Frank, she said, her voice filled with a strange new energy. How much gas is in the car? He looked at her, a slow smile spreading across his face. The light was back in his eyes. Enough, he said. Oakhaven was less a town and more a memory. They found it an hour's drive east, a handful of crumbling brick buildings sinking back into the earth. The quarries had closed 50 years ago, and the town had withered with them. The main street was pocked with weeds. Most of the storefronts were boarded up, their windows like vacant eyes. Mill Street was, as the letter described, an unpaved road. It branched off from the main street and ran along a slow-moving, overgrown creek. And there, at the end of it, was number 14. It was barely standing. A small, two-story brick building, its windows long gone, its door hanging off a single hinge. A faded sign, barely legible, read, Finch and Son, tinsmiths, ivy crawled up the walls, a green tide threatening to pull the whole structure down. It looked hopeless. Helen's heart sank. This was a ruin. A fantasy born of desperation. But Frank got out of the car and walked toward it, his steps slow but purposeful. He didn't see the decay. He saw the bones. He ran his hand over the brickwork, his fingers tracing the mortar lines. He walked the perimeter, peering into the dark, gaping windows. He pushed on the walls. He was gone for 20 minutes, disappearing into the dark interior of the building. Helen waited in the car, her hope dwindling with every passing second. This was a mistake. Another $100 wasted on gas and a foolish dream. Finally, he emerged, covered in dust and cobwebs, a wide grin on his face. The bones are good, he announced, his voice booming with an energy she hadn't heard in years. The foundation is solid stone. The main beams are oak, Helen. Oak? They are sound as the day they were put in. The roof is shot, the floors are rotten, but the box is strong. He was alive. The challenge had reawakened the builder in him. He saw not a ruin, but a project. This is crazy, Frank, she said, the cautious part of her fighting back. We have no money. We have no tools. The place is a wreck. We have the deed, he said, his eyes shining. It's ours. Free and clear. No bank, no son, no one can take it from us. It's a foundation, Helen. Just like the letter said. A place to start again. The conviction in his voice was absolute. This wasn't just a building to him, it was a chance to reclaim himself. It was a chance to build their lives back from the ground up, literally. They drove to the county seat, a larger town 20 miles away. At the records office, a clerk spent an hour digging through dusty archives. She finally confirmed it. The property at 14 Mill Street, Oakhaven, was unencumbered. The taxes hadn't been paid since 1946, but the county had simply written it off as abandoned land decades ago. Because it was never formally seized, and the deed was never transferred, ownership was in a state of limbo. With the original deed in hand, and a sworn affidavit about how they acquired it, they could claim it. The back taxes, after penalties and interest, amounted to $612. It would take almost all the money they had left. It was the biggest gamble of her life. That night, Back in the motel, they talked for hours. For the first time since their world had shattered, they were a team again. Helen, the observer, laid out the risks. The astronomical cost of repairs. The lack of utilities. The sheer, back-breaking work it would require. Frank, the doer, countered every point with a solution. A temporary roof patch. A wood-burning stove for heat. A generator for power. "We can do this, Helen," he said, taking her hand. His was rough and calloused, but it felt like home. "We built one house from nothing. We can fix this 1 inch." The decision was made. The next morning, Helen went to the bank and withdrew the $612. She paid the back taxes. A clerk stamped the old deed, and just like that, they were property owners again. They owned a ruin. They checked out of the motel for the last time. They had $288 left to their name. They spent $60 of it on a tent, 2 sleeping bags, and a cooler. They drove back to Oak Haven and pitched the tent on the overgrown land next to their new home. As the sun set, casting long shadows from the crumbling buildings, Helen felt a terrifying, exhilarating sense of freedom. They had nothing. And they had everything. That night, zipped into their sleeping bags, they listened to the sounds of the country, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of leaves. There were no sirens, no noisy neighbors, no smell of stale smoke. There was only the quiet, and the dark, looming shape of their impossible project. "It's still standing," Frank whispered in the darkness. "I'm driving you," Helen whispered back, though they were already there. It was a promise. The work began at sunrise. The first task was to clear a space to live inside the building. The ground floor was a disaster. Rotted floorboards, debris, animal nests. Frank, with a pry bar from his toolbox, began the painstaking process of pulling up the old floor. It was brutal, physical labor. Helen, unable to do the heavy lifting, became the de facto foreman and logistics manager. She cleared the debris as he worked, piling up the rotted wood outside. They discovered the ground floor was built over a dirt cellar. The air was cool and damp. Once the floor was gone, they had a solid, packed earth surface to work on. It wasn't a floor, but it was level. Their money was draining away on essentials. Bottled water. Canned food. Gasoline for the car to charge their phones. They had a little over $100 left. They were on a countdown to destitution. Frank knew their first priority was a roof. A real storm would flood the building and ruin any progress they made. He needed lumber. He needed tar paper. He needed things they could not afford. One afternoon, a dusty pickup truck rattled down Mill Street and stopped in front of their building. An old man with a weathered face and a cap that read, "Hobbs Hardware," got out. "Heard someone was messing around with the old tin shop," he said, his voice a gravelly drawl. He looked from the tent to the pile of rotted wood, then at Frank, who was leaning on his pry bar, covered in sweat and grime. "It's ours," Frank said, his tone wary. The man nodded, his eyes taking in the scene. He wasn't a threat. He was curious. "Name's Earl Hobbs. My granddaddy used to buy his tin snips from Alistair Finch." He introduced himself properly. He owned the hardware store in the next town over, the one they had driven through to get to the county office. "What's the plan?" Earl asked, gesturing at the building. "Make it livable," Frank said simply. "Starting with the roof." Earl looked up at the gaping holes. He squinted. "That's a big job. Gonna need materials." "Don't have the money for them," Frank admitted. There was no point in lying. Earl was quiet for a long moment. He looked at Helen, who was sorting salvageable bricks into a neat pile. He looked at Frank's hands, calloused and capable despite the tremor of age. He saw their old car, their tent. He saw their desperation, but he also saw their dignity. He saw the work they had already done. "My wife, she passed last year," Earl said, seemingly changing the subject. "She was a quilter. She used to say you don't throw out the whole quilt because of a few torn squares. You find good fabric, and you patch it. He looked back at Frank. "You're a carpenter?" "Cabinet maker, mostly," Frank said. "Close enough," Earl said. He walked over to a stack of old oak beams Frank had salvaged from the interior. He ran his hand over one. "You know good wood?" It wasn't a question. "I've got a load of lumber in my yard," Earl said. "Treated pine and some rolls of tar paper. Been sitting there for a year. A contractor ordered it and went bust. I'll never sell it all." He paused, kicking at a loose stone. "Tell you what. You come by the store. I'll set you up with an account. You take what you need. Lumber, nails, tar paper. You pay me back when you can. No interest. Just pay me when you can." Helen, who had walked over, couldn't believe what she was hearing. It was an act of pure, unadulterated kindness from a complete stranger. "We can't accept that," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's too much." "It's not charity," Earl said, looking her straight in the eye. "It's a professional courtesy. I'm a hardware man. He's a wood man. We understand what it takes to build something that lasts. I'm betting on the fact that you will." He tipped his cap. "Store opens at 7, then he got in his truck and rattled away, leaving them in stunned silence. It was a lifeline. It was the good fabric they needed to patch their quilt. The next day, they drove to Hobbs Hardware. It was an old-fashioned store, with wooden floors that creaked and a smell of sawdust and metal. Earl was there, and true to his word, he set them up with an account. Helen, the bookkeeper, insisted on signing for every screw and every board. She started a new ledger, just for Earl. With materials secured, Frank worked with a renewed fury. He was a man possessed by purpose. He climbed onto the precarious roof, clearing away the debris. He was 79 years old, but on that roof, he moved with the confidence of a man half his age. Helen stood below, her heart in her throat, passing him tools and supplies. They patched the roof, covering the new pine boards with thick black tar paper. It wasn't pretty, but it was watertight. The first time it rained after that, they stood inside the building, listening to the drops drumming on the roof above them, and they didn't get wet. It was a victory. They moved out of the tent and into the building. They partitioned off a small corner of the ground floor with salvaged boards and hung blankets for privacy. They bought a small wood-burning stove from Earl, on credit, and Frank ran the stovepipe out of a broken window. For the first time in months, they had a space that was truly theirs. It was rough, it was unfinished, but it was home. Word of their project, and of Earl's generosity, began to spread through the small, scattered community. People were curious. They would drive by slowly, looking at the strange old couple who were trying to resurrect the Finch place. One evening, a young woman appeared at their door. She couldn't have been more than 20. She was visibly pregnant and had a purple bruise on her cheek. She was clutching a worn backpack. I heard you were fixing this place up," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I saw the smoke from your chimney." "We are," Helen said gently. The young woman, whose name was Sarah, looked at the ground. "I don't have anywhere to go. My boyfriend, he gets angry. I can't go back there. I just need a place to stay for a night. A safe place." Helen looked at Frank. They had nothing. A single room with a dirt floor, no electricity, no running water. But they had a watertight roof and a lock on the door. They had safety. "The door's open," Frank said. They made a space for Sarah in a corner of their room. Helen gave her a blanket and a can of soup, which she heated on the wood stove. Sarah ate like she hadn't had a meal in days, and then she fell asleep, curled up on a pile of old coats. She was the first. A week later, an old man named George showed up. He had been living in his car since the bank foreclosed on his farm. He was a retired electrician. He offered to look at the building's ancient, knob-and-tube wiring in exchange for a place to park his car where he wouldn't be hassled by the police. Frank offered him more. He could have the small, dusty room on the second floor. Slowly, improbably, a community began to form. It was a collection of the lost and the broken, drawn to the light of the wood stove and the sound of Frank's hammer. A young man, kicked out by his family, who knew how to plaster. Sarah's boyfriend, a boy named Leo, showed up, full of remorse and shame. He swore he would never hurt her again and begged for a chance to prove it. Frank, seeing a boy who had never been taught how to be a man, put him to work. The building became a hive of activity. George, the electrician, painstakingly rewired the entire ground floor, using materials from Earl's store. He pronounced the old generator Frank had salvaged from a junkyard to be serviceable. With a roar and a plume of smoke, the lights came on for the first time in 70 years. It was a single, bare bulb, but to them, it was the light of 1,000 suns. The plasterer, a young man named Kevin, began to repair the crumbling walls, transforming them from ruins into smooth, clean surfaces. Frank taught Leo how to frame a wall, how to hang a door. The boy was a quick study, eager to build something instead of breaking it. Helen was the center of it all. She managed the account at Earl's, keeping meticulous records. She organized the work crews. She cooked communal meals on the wood stove, stretching their meager supplies to feed everyone. It wasn't charity. It was an ecosystem. Everyone contributed. George's electricity, Kevin's plaster, Leo's labor. Sarah, her belly growing larger, took over the cleaning and organizing, creating order out of the chaos. They were building more than a house. They were building a home for the homeless, a family for the forgotten. The second floor, once a treacherous maze of rotten wood, was slowly transformed into a series of small, safe rooms. The town of Oak Haven, long dormant, began to stir. The owner of the small, barely surviving grocery store started donating day-old bread and bruised vegetables. The pastor of a church in the next town over brought a load of blankets and coats. He didn't preach. He just saw a need and helped to fill it. This small act of resilience by two discarded old people was creating a new, functional order. It was a quiet miracle on Mill Street. But miracles attract attention. And not all of it is welcome. The threat arrived in a clean, white county vehicle. A man in a crisp uniform with a clipboard knocked on the new door Frank and Leo had just finished hanging. He was a county code enforcement officer. His name was Henderson. He had a list of complaints. An unpermitted structure. Unlawful habitation of a commercial property. Improper waste disposal. The list went on. Henderson was not unkind, but he was a man of rules. He walked through the building, his face impassive. He saw the new wiring, the patched roof, the framed walls. But he also saw the dirt floor, the lack of plumbing, the dozen extension cords running from the generator. "I admire the work you've done here," he said, his voice professional and firm. "But you can't live here. This building is zoned for commercial use only. And it is nowhere near compliant with residential building codes." He handed Helen an official-looking document. It was a notice of condemnation. They had 30 days to bring the entire structure up to code or vacate the premises. 30 days. It was an impossible deadline. Bringing the building fully up to code would require architects, permits, licensed contractors. It would cost tens of thousands of dollars they did not have. The notice was a death sentence for their fledgling community. The hope that had bloomed within the old brick walls began to wither. The small found family they had gathered looked at Helen and Frank, their eyes filled with fear. They had found a sanctuary, and now it was being taken away. That night, the mood was somber. The single light bulb seemed dimmer. The warmth from the wood stove couldn't chase away the chill of impending loss. But they had faced hopelessness before. Helen would not let it win this time. "He said we need to be compliant," she said to the group gathered in the main room. "He didn't say it was impossible. He gave us a list." George, the electrician, spoke up. "The wiring is solid, but it's not up to 2023 code. I can't sign off on it. I'm not licensed anymore." "The plumbing is the real problem," Frank added. "We need a septic system. That means digging. And permits." It seemed insurmountable. But then Sarah, quiet, pregnant Sarah, spoke. My cousin, she works for a local news station. She's always looking for stories. Human interest stories. The idea was terrifying. Putting their lives, their illegal home, on public display. But what did they have to lose? Sarah's cousin, a young, ambitious reporter, arrived 2 days later with a cameraman. She listened to their story. She interviewed Helen and Frank. She talked to George and Kevin and Sarah. She filmed the building, the work they had done, the small, clean rooms. She captured the spirit of the place. The story aired on the local news that Friday. It was titled, The Ghosts of Oak Haven. It told the story of Frank and Helen, of their betrayal by their son, of the piano, of the deed. It showed the community they had built from nothing, a haven for those with nowhere else to go. And it ended with the condemnation notice, the 30-day clock ticking down. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The news station was flooded with calls. Earl Hobbs's hardware store suddenly had a line out the door, people buying materials and leaving them for the Oak Haven project. A retired plumber called the station and offered to install a septic system, pro bono. A licensed electrician offered to inspect George's work and sign off on it. A local architect drew up a set of proper floor plans for free. The community they had built within the walls of 14 Mill Street suddenly expanded to include the entire county. People arrived with food, with tools, with offers to help. The condemnation notice had not been a death sentence, it had been a rallying cry. The 30 days became a flurry of organized chaos. The plumber, a man named Sal, arrived with a backhoe and dug the trenches for the septic system. The electrician worked with George to bring every outlet and switch up to code. Volunteers helped lay a proper subfloor and install insulation. The building was transformed, day by day, by a small army of believers. In the midst of this whirlwind of activity, another car pulled up. A sleek, black luxury sedan. Mark. He had seen the news story. He got out of the car, his expensive suit looking comically out of place against the backdrop of mud and construction. His face was a mask of fury and embarrassment. He found Helen and Frank directing a group of volunteers. What do you think you're doing? He hissed, pulling them aside. You're making a spectacle of yourselves. Of me? Everyone at my firm is talking about it. The homeless parents my partner called you. We have a home, Helen said calmly, her voice even. We built it. This? This is a slum, he gestured around at the organized chaos. This is humiliating. I'm here to put a stop to this. I found a small apartment for you. It's clean. It's respectable. I'll pay the first 6 months' rent. All you have to do is sign this. He held out a document, agreeing to stop talking to the press, and come with me. Let these people, he said the word with disgust, fend for themselves. Frank stepped forward, his eyes blazing. But Helen put a hand on his arm. She would handle this. She was the observer, and she saw her son with perfect, heartbreaking clarity. He wasn't evil. He was just weak, blinded by shame and a desperate need for the approval of a world she no longer cared about. No, Mark, she said, her voice quiet but unyielding. No? What do you mean, no? I'm trying to help you. No, you're trying to help yourself, she said. You're trying to bury your mistake. But you can't. We are not your mistake to bury, Mark. These are our people. This is our home. It's a condemned ruin. It's a work in progress, Frank said, his voice a low rumble. And we're home, Mark. The simple statement, filled with a certainty Mark could not comprehend, seemed to shatter his anger, leaving only a hollow confusion. He looked from his mother's calm, resolute face to his father's unwavering stare. He looked at the people working together, laughing, sweating. They were not ashamed. They were proud. He didn't understand. He couldn't understand. He shook his head, stuffing the paper back into his coat. Fine, he muttered. Fine. Stay here and rot. He turned and walked back to his car, leaving a cloud of dust as he sped away. He did not look back. The final day of the 30-day period arrived. The final test. Henderson, the code enforcement officer, returned, his clipboard in hand. The news cameras were there, as were dozens of volunteers and supporters who had gathered to watch. Henderson walked in. The air was tense. He started his inspection. He went into the newly finished bathroom, where he turned on the faucet. Water, clean and clear, flowed from it. He flushed the toilet. It worked perfectly. He went to the kitchen area, where a new, donated countertop was installed. He tested the outlets with a small device. They were all properly grounded. He walked through the building, room by room. He saw the new insulation, the smooth plaster walls, the solid floor. He saw the small, clean bedrooms, each with a proper window and a solid door. He saw the fire extinguishers mounted on the walls. He spent over an hour, checking every detail. He made notes on his clipboard. Helen watched his face, but it was unreadable. Finally, he returned to the main room. He stood in the center of the crowd, which had fallen silent. He looked at Helen and Frank. "The building is still zoned commercial," he said, and a collective groan went through the crowd. However, he held up a hand. "I have consulted with the county legal department. Given the unique circumstances, and the non-profit nature of this endeavor, we can grant a zoning variance. It can be reclassified as a transitional cooperative housing residence." He clicked his pen. "You have met or exceeded every requirement on the residential code list." In fact, he looked around, a small, almost imperceptible smile on his lips. "In some areas, the workmanship is better than half the new constructions I inspect." He ripped the top sheet off his clipboard. It was a new certificate. A certificate of occupancy. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Peterson," he said, handing the paper to Helen. "This isn't a jail anymore. Welcome home." The room erupted in cheers. Helen looked at the certificate, the official stamp making it real. She looked at Frank, and tears streamed down his weathered face. They had done it. They had won. The story of their victory, of the community that had rallied to save the Oak Haven project, became a regional sensation. The public shaming had consequences for Mark. His firm launched an internal investigation into his conduct. Faced with professional ruin and the very real threat of a lawsuit for elder financial abuse, he was forced into a settlement. A lawyer, working pro bono for Helen and Frank, negotiated the terms. Mark had to return 2/3 of the money from the sale of their house. It was not everything, but it was more than they could have hoped for. $450,000. The money arrived in their bank account not as a victory, but as a quiet vindication. It was not revenge. It was resources. It was a future. With the funds, they were able to properly finish the building. They bought the adjoining vacant lot and started a large community garden. They installed solar panels on the roof, freeing themselves from the noisy generator. They bought the old, defunct grocery store down the street and turned it into a workshop and a communal kitchen. The Oak Haven project, as it came to be known, thrived. It became a model, a place where people who had fallen through the cracks could find not just a roof, but a purpose. Everyone who lived there worked, either in the garden, the workshop, or maintaining the buildings. It was a place of dignity. One day, about a year after the inspection, another car pulled up. Not a fancy sedan, but a modest, well-used minivan. It was Lisa. She got out of the car, looking nervous. She hadn't visited before, held back by her own guilt and shame for not standing up to her brother, for not doing more. She had sent a small amount of money every month, but she hadn't been able to face them. She walked up to Helen, who was weeding a row of carrots in the new garden. "Mom," she said, her voice choked with tears. "I'm so sorry." There were no excuses. No justifications. Just a simple, heartfelt apology. Helen stood up, wiping the dirt from her hands. She looked at her daughter, at the genuine remorse in her eyes. She thought of the anger and bitterness she could have held onto, a poison that would have only sickened herself. She had chosen to build instead. She simply opened her arms. Lisa fell into them, sobbing. "The door's open," Helen said softly, and led her daughter inside. Mark never came back. They heard through Lisa that he had moved to another state, starting over in a place where no one knew his name. Years passed. The Oak Haven project grew, but not too large. It remained a community, not an institution. Sarah's little boy, Daniel, grew up thinking of Frank as his grandfather, following him around the workshop, learning how to hold a hammer. The old piano, the catalyst for it all, sat in the main common room. Frank, with help from a retired tuner who had volunteered his services, had finally repaired it. Its keys were still yellowed, but it played a beautiful, rich tune. Sometimes, in the evenings, Helen would sit and play the simple songs she remembered from her childhood. One warm summer evening, Helen and Frank, now well into their 80s, sat on the porch they had built on the front of the building. They looked out over their small kingdom. The lights were on in the other houses. The sound of laughter drifted from the communal kitchen. Daniel was chasing fireflies in the garden. Frank reached over and took her hand. His was still rough, but it was steady. "You were right," he said. "About the piano." Helen smiled. She looked at the world they had built. It was a world made of second chances, patched together with kindness and hard work. It was a testament to the fact that nothing, and no one, is ever truly broken beyond repair. On the small table beside her was an old, framed photograph of the two of them, young and smiling, standing on the foundation of their first house. She looked at the photo, and then back at the thriving community before her. The light stayed on,